Okay, good morning, everyone. I hope everybody's comfortable. All our guests are now fully mic'd up. Sorry for that slight delay. A very, very warm welcome to you all to this, the 2018 Gathering event. My name is Andrew Burns, and I'm still the relatively new convener of the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations. So if you have any dealings with me over the course of the next couple of days, because it's my first gathering as convener, you do have to be kind to me, please. But it's a real pleasure to be here this morning, and thankfully my task at this first event of the 2018 gathering is relatively straightforward. I'm delighted just to do the introductions this morning, and I'm delighted to welcome Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, to the opening breakfast event of this year's gathering. In terms of the format for this morning, the First Minister, when I've finished in a second, will speak for about 10 minutes or so. And then John Downey from the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations, many of you will know, is the Director of Public Affairs, will come up and chair a question and answer session. Our three panellists will speak briefly before John opens up the floor to questions. And on the panel, in no particular order, we have Celine Sinclair, the Chief Executive of The Yard, Adam Lang, Head of Communications and Policy from Shelter, and Amy Lee Frioli, who's the Chair of the Scottish Youth Parliament. So John will get our three guests after the First Minister's spoken to say a few words about what's important to them in terms of their experience of the voluntary sector. And then John will open up the floor to questions to all four of our panellists. And I'm very optimistic that we'll have at least 30 minutes of Q&A, so there's plenty of time before I'll give the First Minister an opportunity to come back up to the lectern, or John will, to say any closing remarks. And then myself and John are going to escort the First Minister out to the main hall to open the exhibition space sort of formally. So please do allow us, right at the end, please do allow myself, John, and the First Minister to get out the room first, otherwise we'll never get her to the exhibition in good time. And all being well, we should be finished by 9:15 at the very latest. So I hope that's all clear, and all that remains for me to do is to, again, hopefully for you to join me in giving a very, very warm welcome to the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon. Thank you.
It's nice to be told in advance that at the end of the session you're going to be escorted off the premises. That sometimes happens, but I don't always get warned about it in advance. So thank you, Andrew, and thank you very much for opening the session and for your introduction. Let me start actually by congratulating you on your appointment as convener of SCVO. I certainly look forward to working with you in this role, as I've worked with you in previous roles in the years ahead, and look forward also to working with Anna Fowley when she takes up position as the new Chief Executive of the organisation in April. I think it's also appropriate at the outset to put on record my thanks, I'm sure our thanks, to Andrew and Anna's predecessors, Sheila Allen and Martin Syme. Both of them have made an enormous contribution, not just to SCVO, but to the third sector generally, and I'm sure we all want to wish them all the best for the future. I also want to thank all of you for making it here so bright and early in the morning. I, like many of you, I'm sure, follow SCVO on Twitter, and a few weeks back I noticed a particular tweet that had been liked by SCVO, and the tweet said this: signed up for the Breakfast with Nicola Sturgeon session at SCVO gathering next month, then realised that it starts at 8 AM, an hour and a half drive away. The hashtag was not a morning person, which I absolutely sympathise with. So to that individual, I won't name them, if you're actually here, and to everybody else in the room, regardless of whether or not you're a morning person, thank you for coming along. I hope that you find this session interesting and worthwhile, and I hope you've all had your bacon rolls as well as your injection of caffeine. But I hope that you will find, like I do, that coming to the gathering, even at this time of the day, is always a hugely energising experience. I mean, I find, and I've been coming here for a few years now, that simply visiting the stalls and the exhibitions outside is a reminder of the sheer diversity and range of work done by third sector organisations across the country. And of course, these exhibitions, impressive though they are, represent just a fraction of the contribution that all of you and your many colleagues across Scotland make to communities in every corner of the country. So I want to begin this morning really by doing something simple, but something that is very important, and saying a heartfelt thank you to all of you and to the many more across the country for the incredible work that you do. That's something that it's important to say every year, but it's perhaps especially important to say it this year, at this particular moment in time. We see headlines this morning about trust in charities, and of course the stories that have emerged over the past fortnight about Oxfam and some other organisations are deeply troubling, and it's right that stories, revelations like that are thoroughly investigated, that where necessary and appropriate that people are held to account, and that lessons are learned and acted upon. It's also a reminder, and I think a warning to all charities and indeed to all organisations across all sectors of society, of the need to deal firmly, thoroughly and transparently with misconduct whenever it arises. And that's why the Scottish Government last week sought assurances from partners who do such good work with us in our international aid efforts. We will not tolerate, I'm sure, will not tolerate misconduct or human rights abuses wherever these take place. And emphasising that point is important, but it's also essential, and I think this point is equally important. It's essential that the stories and the revelations that we've read about in the last couple of weeks do not undermine or overshadow the good work that is done by tens of thousands of people in third sector organisations, not just here in Scotland, but across the UK and indeed across the world. And it's important that we don't allow these stories, and this is perhaps particularly relevant in the international aid sector, to be exploited and manipulated by those, and there are those in the UK today, who want to undermine the work that organisations active in the international aid sector do. So let's not ever shy away from being open and transparent where that is necessary. But let's also take this as an opportunity to remind ourselves and to remind people across the country of the fantastic work that the third sector does in all of its glorious diversity. And I see that every single week in my constituency work and in my travels as First Minister around the country. I see firsthand just how many people across Scotland benefit from your dedication, your expertise and your compassion. So we must make it clear that your work must be recognised, valued and appreciated. And the theme of this year's event, I Love Charity, is certainly one that resonates strongly with me, and I'm sure it resonates strongly with millions of people across the country. In fact, I can say in all honesty that the third sector makes a positive contribution to virtually every single policy priority that the Scottish Government has. Adam will speak shortly about Shelter Scotland's vitally important work. Shelter are crucial members of our homelessness and rough sleeping action group, which we established last autumn, providing advice on the actions needed to end rough sleeping and transform the use of temporary accommodation for people who need it. Last month, we published a draft strategy for tackling social isolation and loneliness, and that strategy, again, just like the work on homelessness and rough sleeping, recognises the vital role of the third sector in addressing what I think we all recognise is a growing social issue. And the deadline for comments on that strategy, incidentally, is the end of April. So I hope you will all feed into that in the coming weeks. So I've mentioned social isolation and loneliness. I've mentioned homelessness and rough sleeping. These are just two of countless examples I could provide of the positive, invaluable contribution of the third sector. I could have mentioned the reform of social security or the role of social enterprises across the country. However, I want, in the time I have this morning, to look briefly at two other issues which in different ways are very topical. Human rights and Scotland's Year of Young People, which is how we've characterised 2018. 2 days ago, SCVO became one of the founding signatories of the Scotland Declaration on Human Rights. And that's a document that has been supported by more than 100 organisations across the country already. Organisations who want Scotland to be a leader, not a laggard, in human rights terms. And that's been prompted to a large extent by concerns that many of us have that Brexit could be used to weaken the rights and protections that we already enjoy. And that concern has been heightened by the deeply ambivalent attitude that the current UK government has shown towards the Human Rights Act and the European Convention on Human Rights. So the declaration is an initiative that the Scottish Government applauds and supports. In recent years, we've argued very strongly, and we will continue to do so, in favour of retaining the Human Rights Act, and we have sought to embed human rights, equality and respect in everything we do. And a good example of that is our Social Security Bill, which is currently being considered by the Scottish Parliament. That seeks to put the dignity of the individual at the heart of the social security system, something that has been so sadly lacking in the social security system of late. And indeed, the bill explicitly states that social security is a human right, essential for people to realise the other human rights that they have. So we share the concern of many that Brexit could see a regression on human rights, and because of that we see the Scottish Declaration on Human Rights as a really important statement. Because the case for human rights can't just be made by governments, often almost by definition. It's made most powerfully and most effectively by individuals and organisations who are independent of government. In fact, you will very often be doing your jobs most effectively when you outline positions that are uncomfortable for governments, whether that's at UK level or at Scottish government level. So by raising your voices, you're playing an important part in the campaign to ensure that in the years ahead we continue to strengthen, not weaken, human rights protections. And that's, I think, something that is absolutely central to the goal that I'm sure is shared by all of us in this room of building a stronger, more prosperous, yes, but also fairer and more equal country. And there's a link here to the second issue that I want to mention, which is our Year of Young People. One of the things we've promised to do in the current year is strengthen children's rights. For example, we're currently examining the most effective way to further embed the principles of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child into our policy and legislation. And we're doing that first and foremost because I think it's the right thing to do. But it's also appropriate to take these steps now during our Year of Young People. Throughout 2018, we are celebrating the achievements and the potential of young people through a programme of events which has, to a very large extent, been proposed and developed by young people themselves. The Scottish Youth Parliament has been heavily involved in that process, which is one of the many reasons why it's great to see Amy on the platform this morning. And the third sector is crucial to our overall aim of making this country the best one in the world for young people to grow up in. I was at an event on Friday for National Care Day and once again was struck by the passion and the commitment of third sector organisations who are helping care experienced young people to flourish. Celine's work with the Yard is another fantastic example. The Yard helps more than 1,000 families every year, enabling disabled children to experience fun and friendship and a sense of adventure that might not otherwise be available to them. And to give a third example, in recent years, as all of you will be familiar with, the Community Jobs Scotland programme has been a key way of creating job training opportunities for young people. For example, young people with experience of care or young people with disabilities who often find it disproportionately difficult to enter the labour market. And in recent years, that programme has helped around 8,000 young people. And we're confirming this morning that, subject to parliamentary approval of the Scottish Government's budget later this afternoon, that we're funding the programme with a further £6 million in the coming year. And that will support around 700 further job training opportunities for young people. So through that and through the many other initiatives that I've spoken about and many that I've not, we help young people to contribute even more to our economy and our society. And I think that's a good example of the investment delivered through the third sector that can bring benefits to all of us. Now, I'm very aware that the different issues that I've touched on this morning, tackling social isolation, addressing rough sleeping, helping young people, promoting human rights, inevitably, important though all of them are, they don't and can't describe all of the many ways in which the third sector contributes to Scotland. But I do hope they give some sense of the breadth of the contribution that the third sector makes and why that contribution is so deeply valued and appreciated by the Scottish Government. The simple fact is, and this is the point I want to end on, is that in virtually every challenge that our country faces, I say virtually, actually, probably without exception, every challenge that our country faces, the third sector has an important, indeed vital part to play in helping us address that challenge. That's why certainly the Government, and I know the Scottish Parliament more widely, sees the third sector as a crucial partner in delivering social and economic progress. It's why, although inevitably, given the tough times that we live in right now, there will be constructive disagreements on occasion between us, we are determined to build an even stronger relationship with you in the future. That's why I think the gathering is so important and so increasingly important to display that range of the contribution that you make and to allow us to explore ways of working more closely with you in future, which is something I look forward very much to doing, because I do believe that by working together, we will succeed much more in delivering the outcomes for this country that we want to deliver. So let me end where I started by thanking you for the work that you do. I look forward to our discussion that's about to follow, but more importantly, I look forward to continuing to build that relationship in the weeks, months and years ahead. And with that, I'll hand over to John. Thank you.
Thank you, First Minister. I think that really encapsulates where we are as a sector at the moment in relation to what's happening with Oxfam, the drop in the trust figures that SCVO have released today. We are at, as always, a critical time in really different issues, but I think working together, as you say, is a way of taking that forward and delivering something different and better for people of Scotland. As Andrew said, we've got three other panellists from the sector to add to the debate with the First Minister. And I'm going to ask each of them just to say 2 minutes worth on their two key issues. And I'm going to start with Celine, as the First Minister mentioned, working, children's rights, working with families, working with children. Celine, what's your two key points that you would say are vital to your organisation?
Thanks, John. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you very much to First Minister for announcing the continuation of Communities Job Scotland. That makes a really big difference to the charity that I work with, and also to the young people that charity supports. It's a very important way of promoting inclusion within the workplace for children and young people with complex needs. I think one of the key issues that we face at the Yard as an organisation that supports over 1,000 children with additional support needs, principally children with complex disabilities, is that what we see there in legislation, we have very good quality legislation in Scotland that protects and promotes people's rights. So legislation like the Equalities Act can protect the children and young people that we work with. However, on a day-to-day basis, we continue to see a gap between what is there as a right in legislation and the actual experience of the child or young person. And I think we all need to to work much harder to make sure that what is there in law, and recognise the scope and the limit of the law, and make sure that we actually realise that on the ground. So I think really my principal point would be to say we have really good legislation here in Scotland and a great drive through things like Equalities Act, through the more recent Community Empowerment Act, but let's make sure that translates into real experience on the ground for the people that we're trying to support.
Thank you, Celine. Adam, I could see you nodding your head. It's obviously resonating with you what Celine is saying.
Yeah, there's two things that are a priority, two interconnected things that are a big priority for us at the moment, and slightly selfishly for me personally as well. There's the issue which I would echo the point about the welcome focus on public policy issues at the moment. We've had, I think, 11 elections in 10 years in Scotland, and that's been in some ways really positive because it's thrown a lot of debate into the public realm in quite a useful way. Issues have been raised, but it's also had a consequence in that some of the longer term thinking that some of these complex social and economic policy issues need has sort of been batted from election to election. And that, I would echo the point that Celine was making in terms of homelessness. In Scotland, we have some of the most progressive homelessness legislation in the world. We have a really strong rights-based approach to homelessness, but it's not translating fully into that being the experience for people who are homeless on the ground. We've got a very patchwork system of delivery across the country. And just connected to that very briefly, I would say, is the issue of trust, which you mentioned, John, and which others have talked about as well. Because charities have, particularly campaigning charities, but all charities, I think, have a really important role to play in working constructively with governments, local and national, on public policy issues. But we can't do that if people don't trust us. If we aren't trusted by our stakeholders, trusted by the public, trusted by those that support us. And that throws up a lot of challenges and questions, I think, about how we communicate on our issues, how we frame the scope of the complexity of some of the things we're trying to deal with. And there's always a risk, I feel, of trying to oversimplify some of the things that are legitimately complex and need legitimately big and chunky discussions, which can't be, there's very few silver bullets for these things.
Thanks, Adam. Amy Lee, obviously, First Minister mentioned the year of the young person. It's really important for the future of the country. I mean, what's your thoughts as a Chair of the Parliament?
So for me and at SYP, always the issues that matter to us are the issues that matter to young people and the issues that they've told us are important to us. And last year, we done a consultation with over 5,000 young people as to what we would continue on as our national campaign, and they overwhelmingly told us that rights was the biggest issue that they cared about. And I think I'm really pleased to hear that everyone here has mentioned rights and that should be a focus. And I think at SYP, we really think that every decision that is made should be taken with a rights-based approach in mind. But similarly, people need to know more about their rights, because we all talk about rights as if we know what they are and as if everyone should. But in reality, the problem is a lot of young people and a lot of adults don't actually know what their rights are or how to realise them. And I think that can sometimes be why we don't then get these kind of promises that turn into experience. And similarly, I think young people are incredibly worried about the impact of their rights on their rights that Brexit will have. And they have told us that they are incredibly concerned about the right to remain for other young people, and also their workplace rights as we go through Brexit negotiations. So that's definitely what matters to young people, and therefore what matters to SYP and me. So.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, the First Minister's speech was fairly wide-ranging. The comments from Adam, Celine and Amy Lee equally so. So that opens up the debate this morning. What I'm going to do is take maybe a group of 3 questions. If you could say your name and organisation, and I'll kind of pick which of the panellists should answer that question. Obviously the First Minister being one. But so we've got roving mics, so hands up, and I'll maybe choose a few to start. Anybody got a point? Can't all be that shy. The lady over in the corner here. The gentleman up at the back with a looks like a pink shirt. One more. And the lady in the middle here. Craig. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Thanks, First Minister, for our address. I'm Sharon Miller from Theatre Nemo, and this question is on behalf of our founder, Isabel McHugh, who has an MBE for all the work that she's done over the years with Theatre Nemo. So she's not a morning person either, because she lives in East Kilbride. So our question's about the £3 billion per year it costs Scotland in reoffending. Most of these reoffenders are dealing with the effect of adverse childhood experiences, and that has on mental health trauma, which in many cases leads to addiction, homelessness, psychiatric hospitals and prisons, etc. We know that we have to start understanding children's ACEs now, but we also need to look at the effects on the older population that have been abused, neglected, etc., and they are dealing with toxic stress constantly. If we could find a way of supporting ACEs in adults and saving lives and much needed money for the NHS and police, would you be interested?
I'm sure the First Minister would, but we'll get to that. The gentleman at the back.
Good morning, panel. My name is Matthew Midler. I'm a professional fundraiser. I work for Scotland's Armed Forces Children's Charity. I wanted to put quite a broad question to the panel this morning. We're all quite concerned about the anti-charity vibe that there is in the media and across culture at the moment. I wanted to ask if the panel had any thoughts on what we can do as a sector to build up that trust again in the public, in fundraising and in the charity sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. And Craig Dilly.
Hi, I'm Emma Goodlad from the Health and Social Care Alliance. I'm keen to know what the panel's thoughts are on what they feel will be the main impact of Brexit on the third sector generally, but also for Nicola Sturgeon on what, if anything, the Scottish Government is going to be doing to support the third sector through Brexit.
Okay, thank you. First Minister, we'll maybe start with the reoffending question.
Yep. It's a really good question. I mean, we're doing a lot of work, with a lot of success actually, in reducing reoffending, and I think it's, like many issues, it's one you've got to come at from different perspectives. So we're doing a lot of work around reducing the use of short-term jail sentences, increasing community sentence options for courts, and that is having an impact on reducing reoffending, and we've got to keep at that. So we'll currently change the law to increase the presumption against short-term sentences from the 3 months that it is just now to a year, something that some people oppose but is the right thing to do. But the other end of the perspective, I think, is the one you're coming at it from. We need to do even more than we do just now around prevention and tackling the reasons why many people, young people in particular, get caught up in offending behaviour in the criminal justice system. And I hope this is of some assurance to you. The impact of adverse childhood experiences, ACEs as we call them, is much more prevalent now in terms of our thinking right across the spectrum of policy making. The understanding, Harry Burns, who used to be the Chief Medical Officer, has been, he was Chief Medical Officer when I was Health Secretary, and he was probably one of the first people in the world to start talking about this, that some of the causes of diseases that Scotland has a high prevalence of, heart disease, cancer, things that we have for a long time put at the door of smoking and diet and alcohol, and don't get me wrong, these things are factors that contribute there. But many of these illnesses, not just offending behaviour, actually stem from toxic stress that come from the traumatic experiences that children will have at a very early stage. So our understanding of that is enabling us to gear public policy much more to how you prevent that and how you then deal with that as a child moves into adulthood. And I think that over the next few years will shape and reshape our approach to some deep-rooted problems in quite a profound way. And hopefully organisations like yours will play a really important part in that.
Adam, housing and homelessness is obviously a key issue around offending and reoffending. What do you see in terms of, what do you think around how do we deal with that issue in terms of stopping people reoffending?
I would actually echo a lot of what the First Minister was saying. We know that in Scotland the prison population at any one time is roughly about 8,000 people. I might get these numbers a wee bit wrong, but there's somewhere in the region of 20,000 people released from prison every year because of the short-term sentences and remand sentences. Sorry, a third of that number of people who are released from prisons in Scotland don't have a home when they come out the door on a Friday afternoon, and it doesn't make any sense, because we know in advance the day and the hour in which these people will be released from one care institution, and all too often we're releasing them back into the community and they have no home to go to. We in turn know from evidence in the UK, Scotland and internationally that around a third of those people will go on to re-offend. So it's a cyclical process that we don't join the dots between public policy. And this, for me, links a little bit to what we were saying earlier, that we need to get a much more joined up approach to some of our public policy issues and stop breaking them down into silos. It's something that at Shelter we've been talking about for many years, and I know many other organisations in the room have as well. If we silo things into, well, that's infrastructure, that's justice, that's mental health, that's physical health, people, particularly vulnerable people, will all too often fall through the gaps of those services and those policy issues. We need a much more joined up approach to how we legislate and how we implement practice in these things, if we're to do some of that joining of the dots and preventing the obvious side of it, so you can focus the limited resources that we have on the much harder to reach people.
Thanks, Adam. Celine, Matthew's question at the back was, how are we going to retain trust in charities? I mean, your organisation is a big fundraiser. You've got lots of stakeholders, you're dealing with lots of families. How do you see you were going to approach it as you go forward?
It is going to be an increasing challenge, but I think that what is key is not just the way we communicate, but also transparency. And I think that when things do go wrong, people do have to be transparent in charities and hold their hand up and say mistakes have been made. I mean, what we really need to see is much better governance and much better, tighter governance within all charities in order for trust to be built with the public. And I think one of the concerns for me is that with the increase in community organisations setting up small charities, there needs to be enough support there for those charities in order for them to gain trust and secure trust in the public, if we're going to continue fundraising as organisations to deliver what is vital work. So it is about governance, it is about trust, and we need to learn from the mistakes that have been made over the past year to ensure that there is very good, tight regulation in there and good safeguarding measures and very good, robust recruitment procedures.
Amy Lee, I mean, young people are really vital to the sector. They're our future. So what do you think charities in the sector need to do to make sure that young people engage and entrust in them?
I think many young people do trust charities when they understand what they're there for and when they get to work with them. And I think a lot of young people, in fact an overwhelming number of young people, volunteer, which obviously shows that they do trust in charities. But last year, actually, we ran a day of celebrating charities, National Charity Day, and young people from across Scotland put forward a charity that meant something to them or that had an impact on their life. And it was absolutely amazing to see the vast range of charities in different places and that cover different aspects of life that young people recognise and appreciate. And I think it's just about that. It's about raising the awareness of the good that charities do and recognising that, yeah, bad things do happen, but they're one-offs, they're rarities, and they don't define the sector. So you just need to raise the positives and really drain those in, because it's the only way you can kind of overshadow the negative.
I mean, First Minister, I mean, the Edelman Trust Barometer for last year showed that trust in government, media, the third sector was all down, and we've got fake news, we've got globalisation, we've got Donald Trump. There is a trust kind of crisis for the public and everything. So how do you think Scottish Government is looking to address that?
Well, I think it's interesting reading some of the detail behind the figures that you've produced, and the reasons for the fall in trust in the charity sector, and this will be true to a greater or lesser extent across other sectors. It's less about negative personal experiences and more about negative media portrayal and stories. And I should say I agree with everything that's been said about governance and transparency transparency and regulation, some of what I touched on in my speech. But I think there is a bigger issue here. And this is not meant to sound like media bashing, although it will sound a bit like media bashing. But we live in an era just now, not just in Scotland, but probably globally, where, and we could probably talk for hours about the reasons for this, we'll leave that to one side, but we live in an era where there is a media culture that is, it seems to me, much more than has been the case previously, about focusing only on the bad stories and allowing the bad stories to define the whole of anything, whether it's the charity sector or any other sector. And that inevitably, I think, creates a culture where people don't trust anybody. They just think there's, you know, bad practice everywhere, and that's not the exception. They end up believing that is the norm. And we all know that's not true. Now, I don't have the magic bullet answer to that, but what I think it does say is that as well as all the stuff about governance and regulation that's important, I think we've all got a need to work together to be much more proactive in putting across the positive stories about the work that, whether it's charities or even sometimes governments and politics do. That might be more challenging, but getting across that positive narrative. And I'm not saying that's easy, but I think that's what we've got to think about. That's not about ignoring the bad stories, but it's about getting a narrative that's much more about them being put in their proper place, where they are by and large the exceptions. You know, human nature is not perfect. It's not infallible. In every sector of society, you will find bad apples. You will find people who do wrong things. But that does not mean that everybody working in these sectors are wrong or badly motivated. So it's about getting that balance right. And I think while we all come at it perhaps from different angles and perspectives, there's a real need for us to work together to try to rebalance the public discourse around some of this.
Thank you. The final question in that group was on Brexit. I mean, Adam, I'll maybe start with you. I mean, what's your organisation, what are your biggest fears in terms for the sector in relation to Brexit?
So our position, this is probably not anything new to anybody in the room. It's primarily a concern about the bandwidth of government, and by that I predominantly mean the government in Westminster, but indeed all government, Scottish Government and local government in Scotland. Brexit is the issue, and it will be for the foreseeable, and the amount of resource at Westminster in particular that's going into the Department for exiting the EU, and the political capital and the financial capital that's going in there means that that's coming from all the other portfolios, and that has a knock-on effect for local government and other national government policy areas in an English and Welsh context. And I think there's probably an element of that that's true here as well. And it links it a little bit as well to the media side of things. There's not a day goes by that Brexit or exiting the EU isn't, you know, front page story in most papers of the latest, whatever the latest development is. And how do charities keep our issues front and centre for us and in the media and with politicians, local and national, and again going back to that point about the public policy agenda, how do we not run the risk of boiling down complex issues that we all deal with on a daily basis, for which there isn't many sort of switches that can be flipped or silver bullets that can fix the problem? How do we keep the complexity of our issues front and centre without boiling them down to a soundbite just to cut through all the noise of the Brexit stuff? And that's where, for me, the two issues of trust, the gentleman was raising about fundraising issues, you know, how do we communicate with our audiences, how do we build that support, how do we work with governments to keep our issues front and centre? It's all kind of connected for me, and I don't have a single answer, but it's definitely the challenge of the day for charities, I think.
First Minister, the second part of that question was obviously about Scottish Government and the sector working together to overcome the impact, as we know, on individuals, families, communities throughout Scotland. How do you see that playing out as we go forward?
I mean, let me just comment on, I think, some of the challenges for the third sector of Brexit, which will in many respects be the same as the challenges for society overall. You know, Brexit, and all of the evidence says that Brexit is going to have a negative impact on the economy. A negative impact on the economy will have inevitably a negative impact on the public spending capabilities of governments, and that has implications and, you know, worrying, potentially negative implications for the third sector. One of my big worries is around, not always an easy issue for politicians, is around migration and free movement. Scotland, more than any other part of the UK, has a real necessity to continue to attract people to work here because of the demographics of our population. And if suddenly we find that ability constrained, and I think we're already anecdotally seeing the constraints starting to operate, then that will have a knock-on effect for the third sector, as it will do for the economy more generally. And Adam's point is absolutely correct. You know, we, in the Scottish Government, we, you know, in the areas where we have to work with the UK Government, and there are many of them, that has always presented challenges from time to time, if I can be diplomatic about it. But that is much harder now, because simply getting the attention of somebody in the UK Government for anything other than Brexit is, you know, virtually impossible these days. And inevitably, even though as a government we oppose Brexit, we find a lot of our time and energy is inevitably taken up with planning for that. So the implications, and remember, we still don't know what is going to be the outcome of Brexit, but the implications already are many and varied and almost entirely troubling and worrying. What we are doing is a range of different levels. So at the macro level, we're still arguing what I would describe as the case for sanity and common sense. Not always successfully, I hasten to add, but we shouldn't give up on arguing the case for a rational outcome. If the UK is leaving the EU, which I deeply regret, then let's not compound that by leaving the single market and the customs union as well. Now, you know, that may seem a forlorn thing to be still hoping for, but I think that argument is still there to be made and won. And at a much more sort of ground level, we're working as much as we can with the third sector, with businesses, just to try to support preparations at a very practical level as much as possible. But I don't want to underestimate or understate the difficulty in doing that when we still don't know what the environment that people will be working in is likely to be. So it's hugely complicated. I mean, you know, yesterday we've gone from the sort of sunny uplands of Brexit and it was going to, you know, cure every ill known to man or woman, to, you know, the very comforting news from David Davis yesterday is that it's not going to be a Mad Max type dystopia. It's like, well, you know, okay then, that's fine. It's hugely worrying, and we need to, I think, again, collectively just try to work our way through this while not losing sight of the big picture, which is let's not just give up on what is the common sense thing to be doing.
Okay, thank you. Going to open it up for another set of 3 questions. There's a lady in the middle there, and 2 as well. I'll come to you, guys.
Thank you. I'm Claire Stevens from Voluntary Health Scotland, the national network for voluntary health organisations. Scottish Government is in the process of transforming how public health is organised and delivered in Scotland in partnership with local authorities, NHS and, I hope, the third sector. What does the First Minister and the panel think are the biggest public health challenges facing Scotland today, and what do you think the part is that the third sector can play in helping address those?
Okay. Craig, lady just behind.
Excuse me. Morag Cassidy, Light on the Path. Question for the First Minister, particularly about Brexit, and I know it's a very live topic, but one of the funding programmes that comes from the EU is Erasmus+. And Erasmus+ enables young people to have incredible experiences, both coming to Scotland and going from Scotland. Now, European Social Fund, as we know at the moment, what happens is controlled by Westminster, because we have one region. Are there any plans for the Scottish Government to do something to replace that incredible source of funding that not only benefits young people, but also universities and other centres of education in Scotland?
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jane Claire Judson. I'm the Chief Executive of Chest, Heart and Stroke Scotland, and I was really interested in what Nicola said about heart disease and Harry Burns and the ACEs and the sort of toxic environment that people sometimes find themselves living in. We were discussing that in our charity the other day, and if we took that to its logical conclusion, as an organisation, we would reorientate our income spend into young people and into areas of deprivation. And at the moment, we're a traditional post-diagnosis charity, so it'd be a massive shift for us, a very radical shift for us to actually do that in terms of being an organisation in the third sector. What I'd like to ask is, what do you think the appetite is for being that radical and that progressive in the sector, given the risky environment we're in right now around governance and PVG and Disclosure Scotland and safeguarding, and what the appetite is for us to take those moves, and what moves would you like to see the third sector take to be radical and progressive?
Okay, thank you very much. First, I'm going to start with the health question. In terms of where we go, and Celine, I'll come to you after that, maybe on health.
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. I mean, two parts of the question. What are the big public health challenges we face? To some extent, they're the same public health challenges we face for quite some time around alcohol and smoking and diet. And I think Scotland, while we've not cracked all of these things completely, I think we can take some pride, minimum pricing for alcohol, which will take effect later this year. We can take some pride in being ahead of the curve in terms of some of the solutions to these, as we should be, given that the scale of some of the problems are larger here. I think, though, what we should increasingly talk about is as a public health challenge, and one of the biggest ones is the adverse childhood experiences that we touched on earlier on. I think we need to see that as a public health challenge, that if we solve, we resolve a lot of other issues along the way. How does the third sector contribute to that? Well, it does already in so many different ways. But one of the things that I think we need to recognise, which is part of the reason for the sort of reorganisation work that you talked about, is that these big complex public health challenges won't be solved by the health service alone or by local authority. They're cross-cutting in society. And I think the third sector demonstrates this day in and day out, that it's often the third sector that is better at that kind of cross-cutting work and encouraging the statutory sector to work in a similar way. I think there's also, and I've seen this myself firsthand so many times, there's also, I think, often much greater innovation in the third sector than there would be across the statutory agencies. So I think the contribution of the third sector here is immense, and I think particularly encouraging that more joined up, cross-cutting way of seeing and then tackling these issues.
Celine, obviously, the First Minister mentioned adverse childhood experiences. That is much more coming to the fore now and critical to the families and children you work with.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that certainly from from our perspective, the work that we do, the biggest challenge in health just now for us is children and adolescent mental health services. And we do see a great number of children and young people and the impact that has on their families in a very under-resourced children and adolescent mental health service in Scotland. And there are moves to improve that, and they are very welcomed. And I couldn't agree more with First Minister. There is a real place for the third sector, above all within health. And a lot of that is about working together. And we can do a lot of preventative work, above all for the children and young people that we see. There is a role for us to play within that, and we need to work together to make that much better.
Okay. The second question, Amy Lee, was on Erasmus Plus and the impact on young people. We know it's really important, and you mentioned Brexit. It's something that's a real concern to young people at the moment. Do you get any thoughts on how we should address that situation and what we should do?
Well, I don't think I can answer where we can replace kind of the money from, because I think that's not my kind of place to say. However, I think that it's definitely something that needs to be done and looked at, because young people are incredibly concerned. Its impact on how they can study at university. I'm a languages student, so I maybe have a biased opinion, but most of my friends and fellow students are incredibly concerned because they don't know what their prospects are going to be in a couple of years' time when they want to go and do exchange places and things like that. And similarly, it kind of shuts down a career path for many young people who would have, not necessarily even just within languages, but within many sectors, who would have went to work further outside the EU. So I think young people want to see something done to protect that aspect, but we know that the government doesn't have a magic money tree that can just solve that problem instantly.
I'm sure the First Minister would agree with that one.
If we have a magic money tree, I've never managed to find it yet, unfortunately. But on Erasmus, I think what we should be trying to do is not just think about how we replace the money, it's how we stay in the scheme. Because schemes like Erasmus, and one of the frustrations I had during the EU referendum was that, you know, we didn't really manage to get the debate focused on some of the bigger reasons why the EU, for all its many imperfections and frustrations, is a good thing. It's helped to maintain peace across the European continent for you know, the last 60 years. It deepens understanding and shared values between young people. And it's very difficult to quantify the benefits of a scheme like Erasmus, the opportunities it gives young people to study and learn about different countries, the benefits of deepening understanding between different countries and cultures. And the economic benefit is huge as well. I mean, we did an analysis of the benefit through, you know, the money that international students will spend when they're here in this country, and it's enormous, way outweighs the cost of the scheme. So these benefits are huge, and yes, we have to look if we get to this point of replacing the funding streams, but it's a bit like university research. The benefit of these programmes is not just the money, it's the cooperation and collaboration that comes with the scheme and the working within those kind of schemes. So my worry is if we're outside a programme like Erasmus, just spending the same amount of money on it won't actually replicate the benefits, which comes back to the first priority should be staying in these schemes and finding a way, whatever that is. And that's why my frustration at this hard Brexit nonsense just becomes greater by the day, because it's chucking the baby out with the bathwater in so many different things. But then, you know, people who are prepared to sacrifice peace in Northern Ireland for their Brexit obsessions presumably aren't going to worry too much about Erasmus. I mean, it's crazy, crazy stuff, and we all need to raise our voices against it for the benefit of these kind of programmes that deliver so much good for so many people.
The final question was on, and I'll start with you, Celine, because I know you've got some strong views on organisational change and cultural change in the sector. So it's about how radical can we be to change to address a more preventative agenda. And it's not about the prevention itself, but what can we do as organisations to change and make a bigger difference?
I think the third sector is very well placed to be innovative. We do have the freedom to make real changes as organisations. So I believe that there's a lot of entrepreneurial spirit out there in the third sector, and we should be bold.
Okay. Adam, you're nodding.
Yeah, I have a personal sort of huge support for that idea as well. I think that I've been really fortunate in my career to work in the private, the public, and now the third sector. And the third sector, more than any other sector, should be the sector that embraces being bold and radical, because you're not driven by shareholder profits. We're not driven by the many pressures of public sector funding and whatnot. I'm not saying there aren't pressures, of course there are, I'm not belittling that, but above all, the third sector should be the sector that is willing to be radical and bold, and it's something at Shelter we're really grappling with at the moment, because 2018 is our 50th year of existence, and how is a charity like ours, that's not a celebration. The folk who founded us, who are still, some of whom are still alive, didn't found us to exist for 50 years. We were supposed to be a crisis response to an issue, but we're still here. And so how do we use that as an opportunity to kind of recast ourselves a little bit and to say, well, okay, we've done these great things and these things not so well, and these are the challenges that are still there. So how do we take that sort of challenging approach to ourselves and look inward? And it's really hard. It's really, really hard, because you're dealing with vested interests and you know, trustees and in the whole bit. But I think we have to embrace that, because no other sector has the opportunity to do it as well as we do if we can really fight for that and champion that approach.
First Minister, I suppose at the heart of a lot of people would think the heart of change is how we change funding models and funding streams, longer term funding, to actually help the third sector, you know, change, redesign and refinance. I mean, how can we work with Scottish Government to change that dynamic?
Well, it is really tough. It's probably one of the toughest things that all of us are grappling with right now, because what you described there for your own organisation, that decision, do we keep doing what we're doing just now, or do we shift resources much further upstream to try to prevent? These are conversations we have in government all the time. How do we shift resources to prevent ill health, while at the same time we've still got people queuing at the door of accident and emergency? You can't just take the funding away from that overnight. And you know, we've tried over time through change funds and integration of health and social care to ease, and we are doing now, which presents challenges in the acute health sector. We are shifting much more resource from there into social care and public health prevention. So we're all grappling with that. The question, I suppose it's not for me to see how much appetite there is in the third sector for bold and radical change. My observation is quite a lot of appetite for that. But I think we all have to grasp these challenges because, I mean, Adam says shelter was never intended to be here 50 years after its founding. I'm sure there's lots of organisations that would say the same. So we all have to recognise that just continuing to do what we have always done will not necessarily change the outcomes that we've always had. So it's not easy. I think we can all mutually support each other. The government's got a big role to play in supporting the third sector and how we fund and funding cycles and timescales and what we choose to support through our funding. But frankly, you can help us as well, partly by being the sector that's pushing us to go further and go faster, and also helping us through the work you do to support shifts in our funding. But it's, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. It's probably the toughest thing all of us are grappling with. But if we don't do it, if we don't radically change how we do things, 50 years from now, well, probably not all of us will be sitting here, but the next generation of people doing our jobs will be sitting here wondering why we've still got these really deep-seated problems. So the prize is great if we just have the courage to go for it.
Thank you, First Minister. Colleagues, as always, time has slipped away from us, but can we, before I hand over to the First Minister again, can we show appreciation for the panellists in the usual manner? I'm going to hand over to the First Minister for a couple of minutes to say some final words, and then Andrew will come up and thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. I think we've covered, although time is limited, a fair number of subjects. I think I just want to end where we started. All of us live right now in really tough times. You know, the financial climate is tough. The climate created by the Brexit challenge is incredibly tough and leading to lots of uncertainties and lots of anxieties on the parts of lots of people. But at times like this, I think it becomes more important than ever to focus on what really matters and to focus on the positive contribution that the third sector, working with government and other sectors across society, make. And one of the great benefits, I think, of our country is our relative size. It doesn't solve every problem, but it does mean we have the ability to put our heads together and to get together and to work collaboratively to really tackle some big, complex, long-term challenges. Adam spoke about the number of elections that had been in Scotland over the past. I get tired just thinking about the number of elections that have been, but inevitably that does lead to a short-termism. What we're trying to do right now is encourage more long-term thinking around some of these big societal challenges we face, whether it is homelessness and rough sleeping or adverse childhood experiences or how we shift resources into prevention. These are complex issues, but we will not, any of us, solve them on our own. The real opportunity is to bring all of us together, all of us contributing what we can to do that. And I think we've got a massive opportunity in Scotland over the next few years to really crack some of these big challenges. So that, I think, should, notwithstanding all of the challenges that we live through right now, give us all cause for optimism about the future. So let me just end again where I started by thanking all of you. You make a massive contribution to the work that we've been talking about today. It's not easy. What you do is not easy. It's not made easier by the media climate that we all live in, but it's really important work. It's valued by me, it's valued by the government. I think, notwithstanding the figures on trust that we've spoken about, it's valued by people right across the country. So let's just be optimistic about the future and dedicate ourselves and resolve to working together and making Scotland the place where some of these big challenges that are being faced right across the world are actually cracked and resolved. We won't do it without you, and we look forward to doing it with you. So thank you very much indeed.
Well, colleagues, I'm sure, like me, you've thoroughly enjoyed those contributions. I've found it really refreshing to hear such frank debate, not just from the First Minister, but from all our panellists. I think it's been a great platform for the start of what I'm sure is going to be a really enjoyable couple of days across this Wednesday and Thursday here at the gathering. So it just remains for me to ask you to join all of us in thanking not just the First Minister, but also Adam, Celine and Amy Lee for being here this morning, for giving their time and also for coping with the questions from the floor. And thanks to John as well for chairing this morning's event. Thank you. Now, as I said right at the start, just give us a couple of seconds to take the First Minister into the main exhibition hall where she's going to officially open the exhibition space. So if you could just stay seated whilst we take the First Minister into the exhibition hall, that'd be great. And then by all means do join us thereafter, because I think as the First Minister and others mentioned, a big part of the whole event this year and every year is all the stalls out in the hall. So do take a bit of time to visit the stalls as soon as we've left the hall with the First Minister. And thanks again. Hope you've enjoyed this morning's start to 2018 gathering. Thank you.